Now I will tell you a tale of a young prince who lived in a time of peace, until the winds of fate carried him far from home, into a world filled with secrets and adventure. Once upon a time, in a land where golden fields stretched as far as the eye could see, there stood a great and peaceful kingdom. Its name was Averin, and its people were as kind as they were wise. The rivers ran clear, the orchards were full of fruit, and the grand palace upon the hill shone brightly in the morning sun. In this palace lived Prince Edwin, a boy with a heart full of wonder. He was not born into the royal family but had been chosen by fate. Years ago, as a small child, he had been found by King Harold during a journey through the countryside. The king, who had no son of his own, had looked into the boy's bright eyes and saw something special, a spark of destiny. So he took Edwin into his home, raising him as a true prince. And though some whispered that he was not of noble birth, those who knew him best saw that he was kind, clever, and as brave as any ruler should be. The kingdom of Averin was at peace. Each morning, Prince Edwin trained with Sir Cedric, the captain of the royal guard, learning the ways of swordplay, not for battle but as a skill all princes must know. In the afternoons he studied history and maps with Master Alric, an old scholar who had traveled to distant lands. And in the evenings he wandered the palace gardens, watching the stars appear in the sky. But what Edwin loved most of all was riding through the countryside, visiting the villages beyond the castle walls. The people welcomed him with smiles, and he listened eagerly to their stories, tales of enchanted springs, talking animals, and forests where the trees whispered secrets to those who would listen. The young prince believed he would spend his whole life in this peaceful kingdom, learning and growing under the watchful eyes of those who loved him. But fate had other plans. For far beyond the borders of Averin, a secret was stirring, one that would change Edwin's life forever. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, the prince stood on the palace balcony, gazing at the horizon. The wind carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the distant sound of laughter echoed from the village below. Everything seemed perfect. But then, a rider appeared at the palace gates. His cloak was dusty from travel, his horse weary from the long journey. The guards whispered among themselves, for they recognized the emblem upon his sleeve. He carried a message from another land. Prince Edwin did not know it yet, but this message would set him on a path he had never dreamed of walking. A journey filled with secrets, discoveries, and a destiny greater than he had ever imagined. Prince Edwin stood on the grand balcony of the palace, watching as the rider approached the gates. The sun had almost set, casting a golden glow over the kingdom of Averin, but something about this moment felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The rider was dressed in a long cloak, his face partly hidden by the shadow of his hood. He sat tall upon his horse, yet his shoulders carried the weight of a man who had traveled far with heavy news. The guards at the gate hesitated before letting him through, glancing at one another with silent questions. From the balcony, Edwin could not hear their words, but he saw one of the guards nod solemnly and lead the stranger toward the castle doors. A message had arrived, and deep in his heart the prince knew his peaceful days were coming to an end. Inside the great hall, the golden chandeliers flickered softly, their candlelight reflecting off the polished stone floor. The long table was set with a grand feast, roasted meats, fresh bread, and fruits from the palace orchards. King Harold, seated at the head of the table, was speaking with Master Alric about an upcoming festival in the village. Queen Eleanor, his wife, smiled as she poured a cup of spiced tea, her emerald green gown shimmering in the firelight. All was as it should be, warm, comfortable, safe. But then the doors creaked open. The guard stepped inside, followed by the cloaked rider. The man removed his hood, revealing sharp, weathered features and eyes that carried both urgency and sorrow. He bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, I bring news from the west." At his words, the conversation at the table ceased. The warmth of the evening seemed to dim, as if the castle itself was listening. King Harold studied the man, his brow furrowed. "From the west, you say?" His voice was calm, but Edwin knew his father well. He did not trust unexpected visitors. The rider stepped forward, his gloved hands carefully unfastening a sealed scroll from his belt. The wax seal bore the emblem of Eldermere, a neighboring land ruled by an old friend of the king. But the seal was cracked, as if the letter had been opened and read before it reached them. The rider hesitated before handing it over. "This letter was meant for your hands alone, Your Majesty, but I fear it may have already been seen by others." A quiet hush fell over the hall. The king broke the seal once more and unfolded the parchment. His eyes scanned the words, his fingers tightening ever so slightly on the page. Then without a word he stood. The room stood still. The queen's smile faded. Edwin's breath caught. The king's voice was low and steady, yet there was something unfamiliar in it, something Edwin had never heard before. "Everyone but the prince and my closest advisors must leave." The servants obeyed at once, gathering their trays and quietly stepping out. Even the guards hesitated before nodding and following them. Only Edwin, Master Alric, and Sir Cedric remained seated. King Harold slowly lowered himself back into his chair, placing the letter on the table before them. Then, after a long silence, he finally spoke. "King Edric of Eldermere is missing." Edwin's chest tightened. He had met King Edric only once years ago. He had been a kind man, a ruler respected by all. To think of him simply gone, it did not make sense. Master Alric frowned. "Missing? How can a king simply vanish?" The rider answered, his voice heavy. "One night he retired to his chambers as usual. By morning, his servants found the door locked from the inside. When they broke it down, the room was empty. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No broken windows. He had simply disappeared." A chill crept into the room. Even Sir Cedric, the bravest knight in the kingdom, looked troubled. "Who rules Eldermere now?" the knight asked. The rider sighed. "His brother Lord Oswin has taken the throne for now. But there are whispers. Some believe Edric did not disappear of his own will." Edwin's mind raced. How could a man vanish from a locked room? It sounded like a tale from old myths, something spoken of in hushed tones around a fire. But this was real. Then the rider looked at him. Not at the king. At Edwin himself. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully, "before King Edric vanished, he left a final letter, addressed not to you but to Prince Edwin." The boy froze. The king's eyes darkened. "What?" The rider reached into his cloak and pulled out another scroll, this one smaller, sealed with a deep blue wax. He handed it directly to Edwin. The prince's hands trembled as he took it. Slowly, carefully, he broke the seal. Inside there was only one sentence. "The time has come. Follow the path beneath the old oak." No explanation. No greeting. No warning. Just a command. And in that moment, Edwin knew. Whatever was happening to Eldermere, whatever had taken its king, had something to do with him. The room was silent. The king's face was unreadable, but Edwin could see it. The worry, the unspoken fear. Sir Cedric folded his arms. What path? What oak? Master Alric shook his head. I do not know. The prince stared at the words again. He had always thought he was just a boy who had been given a chance at royal life. But what if that wasn't true? What if there was something about him even he didn't know? Something that King Edric had known all along? That night, as the rest of the castle slept, Edwin made his decision. He would go. He would find the old oak. And he would uncover the truth, no matter what waited for him on the other side. The castle lay in deep slumber, the corridors silent except for the faint crackling of torches on the stone walls. Moonlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Prince Edwin did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, the letter from King Edric resting in his hands. The time has come. Follow the path beneath the old oak. The words had played in his mind again and again, like a whisper he could not silence. He had asked his tutors, the knights, even the king himself. No one knew what it meant. But Edwin had an idea. There was an oak tree in the palace gardens, older than the castle itself. Its roots twisted deep into the earth, and its branches stretched toward the sky like the arms of an ancient giant. The servants called it the guardian tree, a name passed down through the ages. It was the only oak within the castle walls. And Edwin had never once thought to look beneath it. He waited until the castle was completely still. Then, with his heart pounding, he slipped out of his chamber. The halls were dark, but Edwin had grown up in this place. He knew every passage, every stair, every hidden doorway. He moved quickly but carefully, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. The guards patrolled the outer walls, but no one guarded the gardens. Why would they? No one believed danger could be hidden among the flowers and vines. But Edwin was not looking for danger. He was looking for the truth. The oak tree stood in the center of the garden, its great trunk thick with age, its bark rough beneath Edwin's fingers. He ran his hand along the surface, searching for anything unusual. Nothing. Then his foot brushed against something. A stone. Small, half buried in the earth. But unlike the others around it, this one was smooth, polished, placed there on purpose. He knelt, brushing away the dirt. The stone was round, carved with an old, faded symbol of a sun and moon entwined. His fingers traced the engraving, and then, with a faint click, the ground shifted beneath him. A hidden door, beneath the tree. Edwin's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, carefully, he pushed against the stone. The earth gave way, revealing a passage leading downward. A tunnel, narrow and dark, descending into the unknown. For a long moment he hesitated. He could turn back now. Pretend he had never found it. Go back to bed, wake up in the morning, and live his life as before. But something in his heart told him this was a door that could never be ignored. If he walked away now, he would never know who he truly was. And so, with a deep breath, Prince Edwin stepped into the darkness and vanished beneath the earth. The tunnel beneath the oak tree was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and stone. Prince Edwin descended carefully, his fingers brushing the rough walls to steady himself. The deeper he went, the quieter the world above became, until at last he heard nothing at all. No wind, no voices, no distant sounds from the castle. Just silence. A silence that had not been broken for a very, very long time. The passage was narrow at first, but as Edwin stepped forward, it widened into a vast underground chamber. Torches lined the walls, unlit, covered in dust. Stone pillars loomed in the darkness, carved with symbols so old their meanings had been lost to time. and at the very center of the chamber stood a pedestal. Something rested upon it, half hidden beneath a fine layer of dust. Edwin's heart pounded as he approached. Slowly, carefully he reached out and brushed the dust away. Beneath it lay a silver pendant, its surface engraved with the same sun and moon symbol he had seen on the stone above. It was simple, yet something about it felt important, familiar. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. And then, a voice spoke from the shadows. "You have come at last." Edwin spun around, his breath caught in his throat. A man stood at the edge of the chamber, his face hidden beneath a deep hood. His robes were dark, embroidered with gold threads that shimmered even in the dim torchlight. His presence was not hostile, but neither was it welcoming. He stood as if he had been waiting, watching, for Edwin. The prince's mind raced. Who was this man? How had he gotten here? And more importantly, what did he know? The stranger stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. "You were the face of the king," he murmured, "but not his blood." Edwin stiffened. The words felt like a knife through his chest. The man knew. He knew. All his life, Edwin had known he was not born a prince. But no one had ever questioned it, not openly. King Harold had chosen him. That should have been enough. But this man spoke as if it was not. As if Edwin's past was far more important than he had ever imagined. The pendant in Edwin's hand felt heavier now. The stranger's eyes, dark and unreadable beneath his hood, lowered to the silver piece. "It was meant for you," he said. "It belongs to your family." Edwin's pulse quickened. "My family?" The man did not answer. Instead, he raised his hand, and the torches along the walls burst into flame. The room was no longer dark. And for the first time, Edwin saw what had been hidden beneath the earth for centuries. A mural carved into the walls. It showed a boy standing between a sun and a moon. His face was Edwin's. Not similar. Not a resemblance. It was him. But the stone was ancient. Older than King Harold's reign. Older than Averin itself. Edwin's throat went dry. Who was he? The stranger watched him carefully. Then, in a voice as quiet as the grave, he said, "You were never meant to be a prince of this kingdom. You were meant to be its king." The underground chamber felt heavier now, as if the air itself pressed against Prince Edwin's chest. The flickering torchlight cast shadows over the ancient mural, the carving of a boy standing between the sun and the moon. A boy who looked exactly like him. The words of the hooded stranger still echoed in his mind. "You were never meant to be a prince of this kingdom. You were meant to be its king." It was impossible. A mistake. A lie. King Harold had found him as a child, had taken him into the palace out of kindness. He had never claimed Edwin was of royal blood. He had never told him he was meant to rule. And yet, here, in a place buried beneath the castle itself, was proof that someone had known of Edwin's existence long before he had even arrived in Averin. He took a slow step back. "Who are you?" he asked. The hooded man tilted his head slightly. "A servant of history." Edwin's fingers clenched around the silver pendant, still warm from his touch. He didn't know whether to run or demand answers, but one thing was certain. He could not leave without knowing the truth. He turned back to the mural, studying the details more closely. The boy in the carving stood tall, a crown barely visible above his head. But the most peculiar thing was the inscription beneath it, carved in a language Edwin did not recognize. "Tell me what it says," he demanded. The stranger's gaze lingered on Edwin for a moment before he finally spoke. "It is the prophecy of the lost king. A shiver ran down Edwin's spine. The Lost King. He had heard that name before, whispered in old stories, mentioned in passing by Master Alric, but never fully explained. It was a myth, a legend from a time before Averin was even founded. But what did it have to do with him? The stranger exhaled slowly. It tells of a child born to a forgotten bloodline hidden among kings, waiting for the time when the world would need him most. His voice lowered as if speaking the next words carried great weight. It tells of you. Edwin shook his head. No, this was madness. He was not some prophesied ruler. He had no kingdom beyond Averin, no hidden past waiting to be revealed. He had been a lost boy in a field. Nothing more. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned away from the mural. I don't believe in prophecies, he muttered. The stranger stepped forward, his robes brushing against the stone floor. Then believe in your own past. With a wave of his hand, a section of the wall shifted, revealing something Edwin had not noticed before. A wooden chest covered in dust, its lid marked with the same sun and moon emblem as the pendant. Inside this chest lies your proof. Edwin hesitated. Then slowly he reached for the lid and lifted it. Inside, wrapped carefully in deep blue silk, was an old, tattered cloak. And beneath it, a crown. Not the golden, jeweled crown of Averin's kings. This one was simple. Made of dark silver, its surface engraved with symbols Edwin had never seen before. And yet, the moment his fingers brushed against it, something stirred deep in his memory. An image. A feeling. A voice long forgotten whispering his name. His real name. The hooded man watched him carefully. You were born far from here, Prince Edwin? He paused, then corrected himself. Or rather, King Edwin. Edwin's breath caught. He had spent his whole life believing he was a boy who had been given a home out of kindness. But now, it seemed he had always belonged to a home he had never known. A home someone had taken from him. His hands trembled as he lifted the silver crown. And at that moment, above them, far beyond the hidden chamber, the bells of the castle began to ring. Not for celebration. Not for mourning. For warning. Something was happening above ground. Something that would change everything. And Edwin was out of time. The bells of Averin rang loud and clear, their echoes rolling through the palace halls like distant thunder. Prince Edwin stood frozen in the underground chamber, the silver crown still clutched in his hands, its weight pressing against his palms like the burden of a forgotten past. The hooded stranger did not move. He stood watching Edwin in silence, as if waiting for him to understand what had already begun. Above them, the sound of hurried footsteps thundered against the stone corridors. Guards shouting orders. The scrape of swords being drawn from their scabbards. Something was very, very wrong. Edwin forced himself to breathe. His mind spun with the truths he had just uncovered. The hidden mural, the prophecy, the crown that had rested untouched beneath the palace for who knew how long. But there was no time to dwell on it now. He turned back to the stranger. What's happening up there? The man's golden eyes gleamed beneath the shadow of his hood. You are out of time. Then, without another word, he stepped back into the darkness and vanished. For a moment, Edwin just stood there, surrounded by stone and silence. He could still feel the cold metal of the crown in his fingers, still see the ancient carving of the boy who looked just like him. But the world wasn't waiting. The bells were still ringing. Something was coming. And if Edwin didn't move now, he might never find out what it was. He dropped the crown back into the wooden chest, wrapped it in the silk once more and shut the lid, There would be time to understand everything later. But first he had to get out of here. Edwin ran back through the underground passage, his boots slamming against the stone floor. The tunnels were twisting, endless, yet somehow he knew the way. As if his feet remembered a path his mind had forgotten. The moment he reached the old oak's hidden door, he pushed it open just enough to peer outside. The gardens were no longer peaceful. Torches flickered between the trees. Shadows moved fast through the hedges. The royal guards were running, not patrolling. Then he heard the voice of Sir Cedric, the captain of the guard. Find him. The prince must be found, now. Edwin's blood went cold. They were looking for him. He could have run back underground, but instinct told him that would be a mistake. The guards knew something he didn't. They weren't just searching, they were afraid. And then, from the palace walls, a second sound joined the ringing of the bells. A horn blast. Not just any signal, the warning call of an intruder. Something, or someone, had entered the castle. And Edwin had a feeling this was all connected to him. He slipped out from the tree, moving through the shadows of the garden as quietly as he could. If the guards were looking for him, he had to find out why before they did. From behind a stone archway, he saw Sir Cedric standing at the entrance of the palace, speaking hurriedly with another knight. His words were sharp, urgent. We searched his chambers. He's not there. The other knight shook his head. Then he's already gone. Sir Cedric clenched his jaw. He must be found before they do. Edwin's heart hammered. Who was they? Before he could hear more, another horn blast rang through the air. Closer this time. The knights drew their swords. Then a third horn. And this time the screaming began. From the front gates of the castle, torches blazed as armored figures stormed into the courtyard. Not royal guards. Not soldiers of Averin. Strangers. Men in dark cloaks and silver masks, their weapons glinting beneath the firelight. They moved too fast, cutting through the first line of defenses with terrifying ease. The knights of Averin rushed forward to meet them, but the invaders were already inside the walls. Edwin's stomach twisted. This wasn't a simple attack. This was an ambush. A plan. Someone had been waiting for this exact moment. And then, he saw him. A figure stood atop the palace steps, watching the chaos unfold. Not wearing a mask like the others. Not holding a sword. Just watching. And then he turned his head, and looked directly at Edwin. For a brief moment they locked eyes. And in that instant Edwin knew. This man had come for him. The man lifted a single hand. And across the courtyard, one of the silver-masked warriors turned sharply toward the garden. Toward where Edwin was hiding. He had no time to think. He ran. Darting between trees, past fountains, through hedges and narrow pathways, his heartbeat thundered in his ears. The castle was under attack, but none of that mattered. They weren't here for the throne. They weren't here for gold or power. They were here for him. And he had to get away. Edwin burst into the back stables, gasping for breath. The horses stirred, their ears twitching, sensing his panic. A single stable boy stood among them, wide-eyed with fear. "My lord, what's happening?" Edwin didn't have time to answer. His mind screamed, "Run, run, run." He grabbed the bridle of the fastest horse, swinging himself up onto the saddle. The stable doors burst open just as he kicked the horse into motion. From the corner of his eye, he saw 3 masked riders enter the courtyard. Too late. He was already gone. The gates of Averin loomed ahead. The bells still rang, the sounds of battle echoing behind him. But Edwin didn't stop. He didn't know who the men in silver masks were. He didn't know why they were hunting him. He didn't know if his father was safe, if the kingdom would still stand by sunrise, if he would ever return. All he knew was one thing. The world he had known was gone, and the only way to survive was to uncover the truth. As he galloped through the gates, the last thing he saw was the figure on the palace steps, still watching, still waiting. And somehow Edwin knew this was only the beginning. The kingdom of Averin faded behind Prince Edwin as his horse thundered down the moonlit road, its hooves pounding against the dirt. The sounds of battle still echoed in his ears, the ringing of steel, the cries of soldiers, the distant tolling of the bells. But he did not look back. He couldn't. Somewhere in the castle, King Harold, the man who had raised him, was either fighting for his life or already lost to the attackers. Somewhere in the halls, Sir Cedric and the Knights of Averin were struggling to protect what remained. And somewhere not far behind, the masked riders were already pursuing him. Because this was not an invasion. This was a hunt. And Edwin was the prey. The cold night air burned his lungs as he pressed forward, gripping the reins tightly. He had no destination, no plan, only the overwhelming instinct to get as far from the castle as possible. But he would not be able to outrun them forever. The road stretched into the unknown, leading toward the thick expanse of the Elderwood forest, a place of tangled trees and ancient paths, where few dared to travel at night. It was his only chance. Edwin spurred his horse forward. The forest swallowed him whole. The deeper he rode, the quieter the world became. The sounds of battle faded behind him, replaced by the eerie stillness of the trees. The moonlight barely touched the forest floor, and the thick canopy above turned the path into an endless tunnel of shadows. His horse snorted uneasily, ears flicking back at every small noise. The Elderwood was no ordinary place. Everyone in Averin knew the stories. It was said that the forest was older than the kingdom itself, that spirits lived beneath its roots, whispering to those who wandered too far, that travelers who entered without purpose never returned. Edwin had always dismissed such tales. But tonight he was not so sure. Then, a rustling behind him. Edwin's heart leapt into his throat. He pulled on the reins, forcing his horse to slow. The sound had come from the trees behind him, not the wind, not an animal. Something was following him. He turned just in time to see a flicker of silver between the branches. They had found him. Edwin kicked his horse into a gallop just as an arrow whistled through the air, barely missing him. It struck a nearby tree, the impact sending bark flying. They were close. Too close. He gritted his teeth, scanning the darkened path ahead. He couldn't keep running like this. The trees were too thick, the paths too winding. He needed to lose them. Then up ahead, a break in the trees. A clearing. And at its center, barely visible through the mist, stood an old stone archway, covered in ivy, half buried in the earth. The ruin. Edwin didn't have time to question it. He steered his horse toward the archway, slipping past the crumbling stones just as another arrow shot past him, missing by inches. Then silence. The moment he crossed beneath the arch, the forest went still. No wind. No distant sounds of pursuit. Nothing. Edwin held his breath, his pulse still racing. He could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against the air. Something about this place was different. The moment he turned back toward the trees, he realized why. The riders, the men in silver masks, were standing at the edge of the clearing. But they did not follow. They couldn't. For the first time, Edwin saw hesitation in their movements. One of them pulled back his hood slightly, revealing a scarred face and sharp, piercing eyes. A leader, perhaps. He stared directly at Edwin, then at the archway, as if trying to decide whether the prince had just escaped into safety, or walked into something far worse. Then, after a long pause, he signaled to his men. And just like that, they turned away. They were leaving. Edwin exhaled shakily, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. They had chased him all this way. Relentless. Unstoppable. And yet, they would not follow him past the archway. Slowly he turned back toward the ruins, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was heavy, charged with something he could not explain. The ruins were ancient, overgrown with moss, the stones cracked with time. Yet somehow it felt untouched, as if it had been waiting for him. Edwin slid off his horse, his legs shaky as his boots touched the damp earth. The pendant at his neck, the one he had taken from the underground chamber, felt warmer than before. He placed a hand over it as if expecting it to pulse against his palm. But it was just cold metal. And yet, it had guided him here. Hadn't it? A low wind stirred the leaves, carrying a sound that sent a chill down Edwin's spine. A whisper, soft, distant, but not in a language he recognized. His instincts screamed to leave, to run, to get back on his horse and flee this place before whatever power slept here decided to wake. But something deep inside him, the same feeling that had drawn him to the underground chamber, the same instinct that had made him take the pendant, told him to stay, to step forward, to see what lay beyond the ruins. And so, with slow, careful steps, Prince Edwin walked deeper into the unknown. Whatever waited for him here, he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The ruins loomed in the moonlight, half swallowed by creeping vines and shifting mist. Prince Edwin stepped forward, his boots crunching against the ancient stone, each step sending a hollow echo into the quiet night. The men in silver masks had abandoned their pursuit. They would not cross into this place. But why? Edwin's instincts told him that the answer lay somewhere ahead. He moved deeper into the ruins, running his fingers along the carved stones. The walls were cracked, but beneath the ivy he could make out symbols, faintly familiar, like something he had seen before but could not name. Then, as he rounded a broken pillar, he saw it. At the far end of the clearing, hidden beneath an overhanging mass of ivy and stone, a door. It was unlike anything Edwin had ever seen. A great slab of dark metal, embedded into the ruin itself, smooth as glass but marked with the same sun and moon symbol that had been engraved on the pendant he carried. The air around it was different, heavier, charged like the moment before a storm. Edwin's pulse quickened. This was it. Whatever secret he had been running toward, or running from, was behind this door. The wind shifted, and suddenly Edwin was not alone. A voice, low and smooth like the sound of water over stone, echoed from the shadows. You were not supposed to find this place. Edwin whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood among the ruins watching him. He wore dark robes, edged with silver embroidery, his long cloak rippling slightly in the wind. His face was mostly hidden beneath a deep hood, but his eyes, piercing and golden, shone through the darkness. Edwin recognized him instantly. The stranger from the underground chamber. The man who had told him the prophecy. Edwin's hands clenched into fists. You again. The stranger stepped forward, his movements too smooth as if he were barely touching the ground. You should not have come here, Prince Edwin. The way he spoke his name sent a shiver down Edwin's spine. not with fear, with certainty, as if he had known Edwin long before this moment. Edwin glanced at the door, then back at the stranger. What's behind it? The stranger did not blink. Something that was meant to stay buried. Edwin's breath came faster. And yet here I am. The stranger exhaled softly as if disappointed. Yes, here you are. Then he raised his hand. A gust of wind surged through the clearing. Not natural. Controlled. The ivy covering the metal door peeled away, revealing its surface in full. And as Edwin's eyes traced the ancient markings, something in his mind shifted. A memory. A whisper. A feeling long buried. The door was familiar. He had seen it before. But how? The stranger's voice cut through the night. Leave this place, Edwin. His tone was calm, but not kind. More like a command. But Edwin had been commanded his whole life. First by his past, then by his fears. Now by this man. Enough. He turned fully to face the door, stepping toward it. What are you afraid of? The stranger did not answer. Edwin could feel his gaze, sharp, analyzing, calculating. And he knew. The man was waiting, watching, to see what Edwin would do next. Edwin lifted his hand and pressed it against the cold metal of the door. The moment he touched it, a deep, low sound rumbled beneath the ground. The stones trembled beneath his feet. The air shifted. And then, the door moved. Not slowly, not cautiously. It swung open as if it had been waiting for him. Edwin staggered back, heart pounding. Beyond the threshold was darkness. Not just the absence of light, a void, a space that should not exist. The air smelled of cold iron and something older than time itself. Then, a whisper, soft, distant, not from the stranger, not from Edwin, from the darkness itself. You have finally come. And before Edwin could move, something reached for him. The whisper slithered through the air like a breath of wind that had never belonged to this world. You have finally come. The words did not echo. They did not fade. They pressed into Edwin's mind as if they had always been there, waiting for him to hear them. And then, a hand reached from the darkness. It was not like a man's hand. It was longer. The fingers stretched too far, the skin smooth and colorless like polished stone. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as though it had all the time in the world. And it was reaching for him. Edwin's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct in his body screamed to run, to move, to step away from the door that should never have been opened. But he could not. He was rooted to the ground, frozen, not by fear but by something deeper, something familiar, as if a part of him had known that one day he would stand here, that one day this thing would be waiting for him. And now, at last, it had found him. Behind him, the hooded stranger finally moved. His voice was sharp now, urgent, losing its quiet patience. Close the door. Edwin turned toward him, but before he could speak, the stranger stepped forward, his dark cloak rippling like smoke. Step away from it. Now. But Edwin's hand did not move from the cold metal of the doorframe, because now he could feel something. A pull. A slow, steady force not dragging him in, but calling to him. The whisper came again. You do not remember, but I do. Edwin's pulse thundered in his ears. Remember what? The hand in the darkness moved closer. And this time it spoke without words. A feeling pressed into Edwin's mind, not a memory, not an image, but a certainty. That whatever lay beyond this door knew him. Not as a prince. Not as an heir to a kingdom. But as something else entirely. And for the first time, Edwin felt the most dangerous thing of all. Not fear. Recognition. The hooded stranger stepped forward again, his voice sharper than steel. "You cannot let it touch you." The way he said it, it was not a warning. It was a command. And suddenly Edwin felt hands gripping his shoulders. Not from the thing in the dark, but from the stranger himself. He was pulling Edwin back, breaking whatever trance had locked him in place. And the moment Edwin's hand left the door frame, the hand in the darkness lunged forward. It moved with impossible speed, reaching beyond the threshold. The stranger shoved Edwin aside, and the hand struck him instead. The moment it touched him, the entire ruin shook. The torches snapped out. The very air bent inward, as though the world itself was recoiling from the contact. And the hooded stranger screamed. Edwin hit the ground hard, his vision spinning. He looked up and saw the stranger collapse. The hand that had touched him was already vanishing back into the darkness. But its mark remained. The stranger clutched his chest, his breathing ragged, his entire arm blackened, veins crawling like ink beneath his skin. Edwin's stomach twisted. The touch had poisoned him. Or worse. The stranger lifted his head, his golden eyes, once so sharp, so knowing, dimmed with pain. But still his voice was steady. "Close the door, Edwin." And this time Edwin obeyed. He threw his weight against it, and the moment the door sealed shut, the ruin went still again. The whispers were gone. The force that had called to him vanished. But the air remained heavy, as though something still lingered, just beneath the surface of the world. Waiting for another chance. The stranger coughed, struggling to his feet. His fingers dug into the stone wall, his body trembling as though it no longer belonged to him. Edwin rushed forward. "You." The man lifted a hand, stopping him. "Do not touch me." His voice was weaker now, distant. Edwin hesitated, his mind still reeling. The stranger had known. He had known what was behind the door. And he had taken the curse himself to stop Edwin from falling into it. But why? Who was he? The stranger's breathing slowed. Then he lifted his gaze, and Edwin saw something new in his eyes. Something he had never expected to see. Fear. Not of the thing in the dark. Not of the door. Of Edwin. The silence stretched between them. And then at last the stranger spoke again. "Now I understand." His voice was no longer commanding. It was quiet. Heavy. Edwin swallowed hard. "Understand what?" The man exhaled slowly. Then, as if answering a question he had feared for years, he said, "You were never meant to be king, Edwin. You were meant to be something far more dangerous." Edwin's chest tightened. "What am I?" The stranger took a shaky step back, his golden eyes never leaving Edwin's face. And when he finally answered, his voice was little more than a whisper. "You are the one they fear." The world around Prince Edwin felt suddenly small, as though the ruins, the trees, even the sky itself had folded in around him. "You are the one they fear." The hooded stranger's words echoed in his mind, heavy with meaning Edwin could not yet grasp. He was a prince, a runaway, a boy raised in a castle that was no longer his home. But something deeper had always been hidden from him. And now he was starting to understand why. The man staggered, still gripping his chest where the hand of darkness had touched him. His cloak was no longer smooth and flowing, it was frayed at the edges, curling like burned paper. Edwin took a step forward. "What happened to you?" The stranger exhaled sharply. "A price," he said, voice strained. "One that had to be paid." Edwin's fingers curled into fists. You knew what was behind that door. You knew it was waiting for me. A long pause. Then the stranger finally lifted his gaze. I did. Edwin's breath came faster. Then tell me the truth. The stranger studied him for a long moment. Then at last he nodded. Listen carefully, Prince Edwin. For once you know there will be no turning back. Edwin did not flinch. Tell me. The stranger took a slow breath. Averin was never your home. Edwin's stomach twisted, but he said nothing. You were taken from another land, far beyond these borders. Not as a refugee. Not as an orphan. His golden eyes darkened. But as something far more dangerous. The wind stirred the branches of the trees, whispering through the ruins like an unseen presence. Edwin's heartbeat thundered in his ears. What do you mean? The stranger stepped closer, his voice quiet. You are not just a lost heir, Edwin. You are the last of a forgotten people. Edwin's breath caught. Your kingdom was not conquered. It was erased. The world tilted beneath him. No, that wasn't possible. Averin had saved him. The king had found him. He had grown up believing he had been given a second chance at life. But now the pieces were falling into place. The prophecy in the underground chamber. The pendant that had called him. The door buried in the ruins that had been waiting for him to open it. And the moment he had touched it, the thing inside had recognized him. Because once he had belonged to it. Edwin's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to my people? The stranger hesitated. And then, finally he spoke. They were destroyed because of you. The word struck harder than any blade. Edwin felt as if the air had been stolen from his lungs. The stranger's voice remained steady, but there was something in it now, regret. You were meant to rule a kingdom that no longer exists. A kingdom that was wiped from the world before you were old enough to understand why. The silence between them stretched long and cold. And then Edwin whispered the only question left. Why? The stranger's gaze was unreadable. Because of what you are. Because the kings of the world feared you. Because they knew that if you ever returned, everything they had built would fall. The weight of the truth settled over Edwin's chest like a stone. All his life, he had thought he was simply a prince with no past. Now he understood. He was not meant to inherit a throne. He was meant to avenge one. And every kingdom in the world was afraid of the day he would remember. The stranger straightened, though his breathing was still heavy. Now you must decide. Run and they will find you again. Or face your past and become what you were meant to be. Edwin looked toward the distant trees. The road ahead was unknown. But for the first time in his life he knew where he was going. And he knew that once he took this path, he could never turn back. So with a deep breath he stepped forward. And the world shifted around him. For the first time in centuries, the lost king had returned.